Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's Twilight Online Understanding Cannabis Medicines Part 2, Prescribing in General Practice webinar. My name is Samantha, and I am your host for this evening. Before we make a start, I would just like to make a quick acknowledgement of country. We recognise the traditional custodians of the land and sea on which we live and work, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. So, to introduce our presenters for this evening, we are joined by Dr. Jan Fizzle. Jan is a public health physician working as a medical advisor in the Office of the Chief Health Officer at the New South Wales Ministry of Health. She has been working on facilitating the New South Wales clinical trials program for medicinal cannabis and cannabis-derived products and assisting in cannabis therapeutics policy development in New South Wales. Jan also has a keen interest in health technology assessment and population-based screening programs. And our second presenter and facilitator for this evening is Dr. Harry Nespollen. Harry is the current chair of Sydney North PHN and principal of 2 general practices in Sydney. Harry is also a fellow of the RACGP and has been a quality assurance examiner for the OSCE component of the fellowship exams for the past 10 years. So thank you for joining us and welcome, Harry and Jan.
Thank you. With that great introduction, I'm just going to hand over immediately to Jan to present Cannabis Medicines, Prescribing in General Practice.
So good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. So we have some learning outcomes for this evening's session, and we're hoping that at the end of the activity you'll have some better ideas about the pathways, requirements and processes to lawfully prescribe and supply cannabis medicines in New South Wales, that you'll have a better idea of where some of the reliable information is on what cannabis medicines to prescribe. You'll also be able to discuss the ethical and legal responsibilities, plus the liabilities that apply to prescribers when using unregistered medicines. And that includes thinking about informed consent processes and precautions when using unregistered medicines, and explain the different roles of GPs and specialists in cannabis prescription and the requirements for ongoing patient monitoring. So we'll do a very quick review of the session that we had a couple of weeks ago, just looking at the cannabis medicines, and then we'll have a look at the regulation and prescribing pathways, have a look at some of the medicines that are available, then thinking about what to consider when prescribing a cannabis medicine, working as a prescribing and monitoring team. I'll briefly go into the informed consent processes that are expected by TGA as part of prescribing unregistered therapeutic goods, and also talk about driving and heavy machinery or just the workplace THC testing that some patients are encountering. We'll also talk about monitoring outcomes of the treatment and think about some of the reliable sources of information. So cannabis as a therapeutics being used for thousands of years. It was used widely in the 19th century for many different things, including palliative care of patients with rabies. It was regulated worldwide from the late 19th century, such that widespread medical use had really ceased in the 20th century. Research in Israel in the late 20th century helped us identify an endogenous cannabinoid system and showed that this cannabinoid system has an influence on disparate body systems, including neurological. It modulates immune function, gastrointestinal effects. And the other thing to consider is that previously, when we were using pure plant-derived products, the cannabinoids that people ingested or inhaled were particularly THC. But as commercial investigation goes for other cannabinoid uses, we're starting to see larger doses of these other cannabinoids being used in therapeutic terms, and to some extent they're not things that people have been exposed to through recreational use. So we've got 2 main compounds available to prescribe in Australia at the moment. Many of the cannabis medicines in Australia are plant-derived products, so they also have a spattering of other cannabinoids and terpenes and other things that can have some biochemical and pharmacological function. We've got delta-9 THC, which is the most studied phytocannabinoid. It's responsible for the psychoactive effects of cannabis. It can help reduce nausea and vomiting, and in fact a synthetic THC dronabinol is registered in the US and Canada for that indication. In animal models of pain, it's a reducer of pain. It may improve appetite. People are famous for the munchies, but unfortunately in clinical trials in cancer patients, it hasn't worked so well. So we're looking again at how that might be working in our clinical trials. It's both got anticonvulsant and proconvulsant dose-dependent qualities, and the oral doses are usually starting quite low, and a recommended maximum is about 30 milligrams a day. Cannabidiol is the other next most studied phytocannabinoid. It's not intoxicating. It can be sedative. It's really good at interacting with the cytochrome P450 system, and so it's important to consider other drugs that patients are on when prescribing cannabidiol. We're seeing quite large doses being used in pediatric epilepsy. We don't have good evidence around cannabidiol alone having a clinical effect in low doses, and that's mostly because the clinical trials have not been done. In models, it's antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, it may be neuroprotective, and it may modify some of the psychoactive effects of THC, but it's important to understand that just because you give somebody cannabidiol alongside their THC doesn't mean that they're free of the chances of having a unfortunate adverse event. So things that your patients might be asking you about or considering include the ongoing cost. So to say that there's a standard cost is not correct. It's quite variable depending on the condition and dose required, because the charge is usually for the amount of cannabinoid used daily, rather than because of all the drug development costs and so on. So a patient who's on 5 milligrams a day will have a very different cost to somebody who's on 2 grams a day and that's just how the pricing model is at the moment, and that's why you see these widely varying costs quoted to patients. Most unregistered medicines, if they're supplied out of our hospitals, have been evaluated by a Drugs and Therapeutics Committee, and they'll usually often be funded at the same time. At the moment, for most cannabis medicines, there's not the evidence of efficacy such that they could be considered cost effective. And so the medicines are normally not being provided by hospitals and LHDs, which is why GPs are saying to see patients seeking use of unregistered medicines in general practice. Because I don't think it's particularly common, is it, Harry, for unregistered medicines to be being used?
That's correct. Often you'll be approached by a patient rather than the other way around.
Yeah. Pharmacies need to be identified to order in the medicine. They generally do not hold stocks of the medicine, so that's usually about a 2 to 3 day delay in the medicine actually getting from you having an approval to actually someone shipping the medicine into a pharmacy where it can be dispensed. The other thing is that unlike other medicines where you can give a patient the consumer information, there's no reliable consumer information for the unregistered therapeutic goods. A lot of the cannabinoid companies have brought stuff in from Canada. That's not been reviewed by a regulator. There's no quality control on it like you see with consumer medicine information in Australia. So you just have to be slightly cautious about what information people are getting and what information you're giving to people.
Is it easy for the pharmacies to get the product if it's here in Australia?
It's relatively easy, I understand, for a pharmacy to get the product in. A lot of the goods are held at standard wholesalers around Australia, and the challenge can be if there's a cold chain requirement of shipping the good, and different cannabinoid products have different stability testing about how well they go outside of being kept cold. So that can be a bit challenging. There's also the fact that we've been given in New South Wales Health the advice from an expert group that you really shouldn't be driving with THC on board. There's no defence under the Drug Misuse and Trafficking Act for being caught with THC in your oral fluid just because it was prescribed, because the levels at which we see clinical effects of THC are also the levels at which we see impairment from THC. We also know that some workplaces do on-the-spot drug testing, and then that's up to the doctor and the patient and perhaps the place of employment to negotiate, well, how much does that particular drug impair that patient? Is it safe for them to operate heavy machinery? Or is it safe for them to be making important decisions even if they may have some impairment? And that's a similar assessment that you'd be doing with any other medicine that can cause significant drowsiness or impairment of cognitive function. One just needs to be really careful about talking it through with your patients about, you may have a limit on what you can actually do at work, and we shouldn't just confine that to forklift trucks. If you've got to make important financial decisions, it's important that you're clear thinking as well. So a lot of discussion is about the regulation of cannabis medicines, and they're in a really unusual place because we've got a demand for unregistered medicines, and they're also regulated by both national processes, by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and then by state processes where we're interested in safe use of controlled substances, so S8 drugs. So nationally, there's a National Scheduling Committee, a group of experts that provide advice about which schedule a particular pharmaceutical might sit in. And so we have S4 prescription-only medicines and cannabidiol-only medicines that have only a trace of THC fit into the S4. S8 medicines, which are the controlled drugs, and then S9 are prohibited drugs. And anything with cannabis that isn't actually coming in under TGO 93 is likely to be prohibited still. We then have the decision by the TGA to list or not on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. We then have assuming the sponsor makes an application for the medicine to be listed or not on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, looking at the cost effectiveness of those particular medications for a particular condition. The TGA has developed a standard for medicinal cannabis, which talks about making sure that we've got a certain amount of cannabinoid in each product, that it's free of heavy metals, and that it's free of contaminants. And that's what TGO 93 looks at. We have national decisions about import and export, but most products that people would use are on shore. And then we have the use of unapproved medicines, which is a TGA decision. In New South Wales, we need to adhere to a number of different parts of legislation. So we have the Poisons and Therapeutic Goods Act, which is mostly around looking at how we package, label, store, write prescriptions, make sure that we keep records of supply, particularly of controlled substances. We also have the Drugs Misuse and Trafficking Act, and a person who's lawfully prescribed a prohibited drug is not committing an offence. So if the person's been lawfully prescribed a cannabis medicine, if the doctor's received an authority from the New South Wales Ministry of Health to prescribe an S8 drug, then that person is not committing an offence. We also have in New South Wales the Care and Protection of Young Persons Act, and this is about protecting vulnerable people from doctors doing things to them that perhaps shouldn't do. And so within that, we shouldn't carry out special medical treatment on a child, so that's defined in this Act as a person under 16 years, otherwise than in accordance with this section, and that means we shouldn't be prescribing a psychoactive drug to a child for more than 10 days in any 30 days. We also have the Guardianship Act, and that has a protection for vulnerable people who are unable to consent regarding special medical treatment. So again, using psychoactive drugs that aren't endorsed by a professional group or standard. And so for patients with dementia who are actually unable to consent, you're probably best off going and talking to the Guardianship Board, because a relative can't consent for you to do special medical treatment on a vulnerable person. So if there's any concern that the person may not be competent to consent to the treatment, I'd really encourage people to get guidance. So doctors applying for an authority prescribed in New South Wales. Now, this is completely different to the PBS authority system. There's too many words with authority in them at the moment, and it all gets very confusing. I'm sorry, I've come in on the end of lots of people naming things all the same thing, so I can only apologise for my forebears. But an authority to prescribe in New South Wales is about prescribing certain controlled substances, and that includes Schedule 8 opiates for a drug-dependent person. It includes the prescription of certain benzodiazepines. It includes prescription of an unregistered or extemporaneously compounded Schedule 8 products. So, for example, we've had previously people trying to compound ketamine injections. Those people would now have to get an authority to be able to prescribe those compounded ketamine injections. Schedule 8 cannabis medicines, including nabiximols, and there are certain other restricted products, mostly to do with reproduction hormones and things that can be easily diverted. So who's looking at what in brief? So if you have a look at the Commonwealth's looking at the product. Is it a product that complies with TGO 93, or is it a registered medicine overseas? The Commonwealth looks at the patient, including the seriousness of the patient's condition, and they also look at the health practitioner applicant's qualifications, expertise, and also how long they've had a therapeutic relationship with that patient. Within the state, we still look at issues of diversion. So if there's been a history of practice such that it's likely that a patient could have diverted opiates from a same practice, for example, or a patient has a history of drug dependency that the doctor may not have been aware of. The issues of appropriateness of use of an unregistered controlled drug. So generally speaking, we're leaving the clinical assessment to the TGA, but if we start seeing, for example, THC being prescribed for hangnails, we might have something to say about that. And also we do check to see if, say, for example, an application went through to the Commonwealth to prescribe a THC product for a 15-year-old. We would then have to say to that doctor, did you realise that we've now got to go and talk to Department of Youth and Community, to Family and Community Services about this. And that's just to get permission to prescribe that. So we have medicines that are on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, which includes nabiximols, which is Sativex, which is marketed in Australia. You do not have to apply to the TGA to prescribe nabiximols to patients. You do need to notify New South Wales Health and get an authority to prescribe. And it's available in Australia. It's registered. It's got a huge amount of safety data behind it. And so you're on fairly solid ground as far as being able to look up a product information, having appropriate consumer medicines information. So you're on fairly safe ground with nabiximols as far as looking at the evidence, because a lot of the clinical trial evidence is generated using nabiximols. And so that, but also you've got evidence against use, where a clinical trial is not showing a benefit.
One of the questions is there much inter-batch variability in the quality of the product?
So with each batch, the supplier has to provide a certificate of analysis with the batch. There can be some batch-to-batch variability. I was really surprised to find out that standard pharmaceuticals can have plus or minus 10% of what's on the label. And for cannabis medicines, it can be up to plus or minus 20% because they're plant-derived products. So it is about making sure that you're aware of the quality. You could even ask for, can you show me more than one batch certificate? And you might get an idea of who's providing stable batches versus who's got widely varying cannabinoid content. So it's that they have within plus or minus 20% of what they've got on the label.
Does that have much of a clinical effect?
Do we know of? I think at the moment we're not at precision dosing levels with many of these things, because the absorption of these medicines is so variable from person to person. I'm not a pharmacologist, but my understanding is, different people will process them differently. So I think individual person-to-person variation is almost as important as batch-to-batch variation. But having said that, if we're looking at someone like a small child with epilepsy, where cannabidiol can increase the levels of their other anti-epileptic drugs from a therapeutic range to a toxic range, we've got to be particularly careful about trying to get as much of a standardised product as possible for, particularly if we're dealing with small children who require, large doses of cannabinoid but are not going to tolerate variations as much potentially. We've also got medicines registered with the overseas regulators, dronabinol, which we're seeing some applications for being used here, and marinol's the usual trade name for that. There's nabilone, which is a THC analogue that's also registered in the US and Canada. And there's a cannabidiol product called Epidiolex, X, which we're currently using in our compassionate access scheme for kids. And it's heading for FDA approval. It's recently passed one of the big hurdles, and so we're expecting to hear something in June about it potentially being registered in the US. So there are registered medicines available. They're sometimes more expensive than the plant medicines, but you do get that, for something like dronabinol, which is a synthetic, there's no batch-to-batch variability beyond any other standard pharmaceutical. So just to speak a bit more about nabiximols, and the reason why I'm talking more about it is it is actually registered. So you've got lots of information there. You've got drug-drug interactions. You've got lots of things available to you. It's actually registered for use in refractory spasticity and multiple sclerosis here. It went to PBAC for a decision and it wasn't considered to have significant enough clinical efficacy to then go on and assess the cost effectiveness. So at the moment it's not available in the PBS. It's being used in lots of clinical trials, as I mentioned before, some of which are quite small. So I think the rheumatoid arthritis trial had less than 50 people on it, but it still had some effect. And I've provided the link to the New South Wales notification required, and that authority gets transmitted back to you so that you can send off the information to the wholesaler and your chemist can get it in for your patient. So then we go on to our unregistered medicines that are available, and this is that Therapeutic Goods Order 93. They're currently all imported from overseas. However, some of the production companies are saying they'll have local products soon. They are manufactured under good manufacturing practice for pharmaceuticals. There's different levels of GMP. One is for food standards, which is where you see a lot of the products coming out of Europe are compliant with the food standard, which is nowhere near as rigorous as a pharmaceutical standard. So they do have a known cannabinoid content. They are free of heavy metals. Any information a supplier may give to you has not been assessed or approved by a regulator. You won't get any information generally about the product-specific absorption, dose, side effects. Some of them have actually been used in clinical trials overseas where an ethics committee's had to review an investigator brochure, so that might give some comfort that there's some of that data available. They haven't been assessed for TGA for safety or efficacy, and a lot of their use is extrapolated from registered medicines or studies in other countries. So when we think about the unregistered medicines, the safety efficacy data is often not available, or if it's available, it hasn't been reviewed by a regulator. They're often in carrier oils, and it's important to understand each one. So if you've got somebody who's intolerant of sesame or coconut or lots of different oils that they're in, you need to understand which oil they're in. So you need to ask the question. Some people would like to vape the products. There are no actual devices registered with TGA to vape medicines. There are some devices registered overseas. One thing to keep in mind, though, with vaping is that we do have a Clean Air Act, and it's very difficult to tell whether you're vaping medicinal cannabis or doing something else. And so there are some limits. And then there's the hard limits of the fact that, something that's potentially flammable and oxygen just don't mix. So there's all of those considerations as well. There's no need for these products to have an ongoing supply guaranteed. They're available, and as long as they're in stock, but there's no guarantee that they're going to be resupplied from overseas. And there's no published product information for your consumers. So if you wanted to know all about the different medicines that are available, there's over 50, I think I counted today, that are currently available. This is where you can go and see the full list of products. They are usually manufactured in Canada. They've been imported, they're onshore, and they're dispatched from the importer to the nominated pharmacist. So when we talk about prescribing unregistered medicines, it's usually done through three major routes. One is the clinical trials route, and TGA has two particular schemes: the clinical trial notification, where an ethics committee signed off that the product's appropriate to use in a clinical trial, and the other is the clinical trial exemption, where the TGA actually does the assessment of the products. Most clinical trials using cannabinoids are using the clinical trial notification scheme, so an ethics committee's reviewed it. The special access scheme, where there's category A, you still need state approval for an S8, and category B, which is your standard pathway where TGA does it. I'd really encourage people to use category B. There's no true advantage to using category A for cannabis medicines with our single notification pathway. Authorised prescriber is yet another pathway which involves having an ethics committee endorse a particular plan of treatment. So the special access schemes legislation to ensure Australians can access medicines prior to registration, or, for example, if a drug company chooses to withdraw a registered medicine here and a patient was using it, they can have a supply imported from elsewhere in the world where the medicine's still available. It's administered by the TGA. For us, it's a single form to the TGA, and TGA sends to New South Wales the state authority. And you can see TGA's put this illustration around, trying to balance how much evidence you have to provide to use a particular medicine versus the clinical need of a particular patient. And so my poor hangnail patients would probably need very high evidence before TGA approved use of an unregistered good to treat hangnail. The special access scheme, so the TGA advises that if you're considering using the special access scheme to prescribe, you need to understand that it's not been evaluated for quality, safety or efficacy, and it's not an approval by TGA. They're looking to see, is it within the realms of safety and not so inappropriate, it's unimaginable. They're not looking to say, yes, this is good. They're not endorsing your practice. They can't guarantee the quality, safety or efficacy of an unapproved product. They've tried to put some safety there by saying, here's the cannabinoid content, it's free of this and it's free of that, but they can't say somebody's not going to have a paradoxical reaction or even an expected reaction to the medicine. And the thing that is, you don't have to prescribe an unapproved medicine if you don't think it's right to do so. It's really important not to feel pressured into doing that. So the TGA is quite explicit about the obligations of informed consent. The product, so your patient needs to know it hasn't been approved by a medicines regulator. They have to understand the benefits of treatment and risks and adverse effects. The possibility that there could be things that we haven't known about or late adverse effects. And the patient should also be aware of other treatments that are available to them. TGA advises that the consent should be recorded and written if possible. The patient should probably think about the costs of treatment before you send off their data to the TGA. So you need to have a good conversation with the patient before you start talking to organisations like TGA and New South Wales Health. We don't need to know about your patients if once they're told about the cost, they're not going to want it. So have that good conversation with your patient before you submit their data. Some companies are promoting their website as a great pathway to easy prescribing. I'd really suggest that you think about your patient's privacy and make sure that they consent if you're going to use any of those private prescribing services, because if their data gets leaked from one of those services, you need to be assured that it's going to be secure. And just a reminder around do not drive if it's a THC containing product. We need to make sure that we've got appropriate clinical tools to monitor the health of your patient. And that usually would involve having a treatment plan, so that if an agreed outcome is not being met, the doctor could consider discontinuing the treatment. You've actually got an objective measure that's been negotiated between you and your patient. And sometimes that's really important, because we've seen that often cannabis medicines, because they are what's being tried after everything else has failed, there's a great temptation to keep going even if the treatment outcomes aren't being met. But this is coming at a physical risk to the patient, at financial risk to the patient, and so it's really important that we've got some good way of having that conversation right up front, that if we haven't met these treatment goals, and have them agreed. Now, that's not to say that you might not reassess the treatment goals, because whilst, you know, the pain wasn't a lot better, I was sleeping a lot better though, doctor, I feel better because of that, you might consider in that clinical consultation that that's a worthwhile treatment outcome, and on the basis of that you're ready to go. But to capture that treatment outcome, you've got to think about it as you start or as you're titrating the dose of cannabinoid. It's important to remember that you need to report serious adverse events to the TGA and to whoever supplied you with the medicine. And the TGA is going to look for your objective evidence of how you've been monitoring the patient and how they're going along, and making sure that things are being monitored. And, you know, that may also include patients being willing to keep a pain diary or a seizure diary, or, you know, there's lots of clinical tools for monitoring how people are feeling, and it's about using ones that you're familiar with and you're happy for you to educate your patients on. So the authorised prescribers scheme, we'll just touch on that. So this actually involves you developing a clinical protocol that talks about how a particular drug will be used in a particular population of patients who have a particular condition. It has a defined dose regime where you escalate according to a particular dose. It's got defined monitoring and defined starting and stopping rules. It's usually endorsed by an NHMRC endorser or a college ethics committee. My understanding from looking at the RACGP website is currently the RACGP's ethics committee isn't looking at authorised prescribers at the moment for anything, not just cannabis. It's just not a thing they've got capacity for at the moment. And authorised prescribers still need to notify New South Wales Health for each patient to get an authority for each patient, because again, there's that potential where a person has a particular history of drug dependency that a prescriber may not be aware of. So we still need to make sure that we minimise the risk of diversion for the community.
Just going back to the Medicinal,
yeah,
because it's an S8, they need an authority from the beginning. It's not just the dependent patient. So you'll need that combination TGA, New South Wales authority.
Nabiximols, TGA, just
Correct,
us. Just us, just New South Wales Health to do the authority for Nabiximols, and it's a registered medicine, and we're turning those around in a matter of hours.
But it's from the very first one. From
the very first go, and that's simply because we're still monitoring the uptake in the community. It's an S8 controlled drug. We're hoping that, like overseas, we'll see that there's, you know, fairly small risk of diversion, fairly small risks, and then we can talk about rescheduling things. But at the moment, it's an S8 drug, and so we've got the fairly tight controls at the moment.
And just before we move on, is there any protocols regarding ongoing management of the patient in terms of regular blood testing or those sorts of issues?
So it very much depends on what you're prescribing for a patient and why you're prescribing it. So, for example, for a child with epilepsy who's having high-dose cannabidiol, they're having their liver function regularly monitored and having therapeutic drug levels regularly monitored. If you had a patient, for example, who was having a combination product with cannabidiol who was on warfarin, you'd want to be watching their INR very closely. They don't seem to be causing a lot of renal impairment, and as I say, the cannabidiol, we're not sure whether it's only in the very high dose patients who tend to have their liver function go off. So it's more about monitoring the clinical condition and seeing how your patient's going, and if you've got any concerns, just checking in. But I'll talk about a service that's available to help doctors later in our presentation. So at this point, having given you all the bad news, we're getting to some of the better news. So this is when it's a reasonable time to talk about prescribing a cannabis medicine with your patient. So you've looked at the therapies with better evidence, you've used them, or they're contraindicated for this particular patient. A good example is we have patients who don't tolerate megestrol acetate for stimulation of appetite in their palliative care patients. So they've sort of done step one, and they couldn't tolerate the steroids because they stayed up all night awake and not tolerating it. They couldn't tolerate the megestrol, or it was contraindicated because of the type of cancer they had. And so to stimulate appetite, we'd really like to try some THC-containing product, thanks. And so that's reasonable. They don't have to have had a new episode of steroid psychosis to qualify, if that's it. It's the past history of intolerance is all people are looking for. We're not looking for people to get tortured in the line of getting approved. It's helpful if there's high-quality clinical evidence of efficacy, or, for example, where we're looking at something like spasticity in multiple sclerosis, spasticity in spinal cord injury, spasticity, with a similar pathophysiology, you can reasonably extrapolate it's likely to be effective for your patient. You might have a significant number of case reports with good preclinical evidence of likelihood of efficacy for some patients, because we'll never, for some people with rare diseases, we'll never get a large cohort. But the really important thing is that both the doctor and patient are aware of the uncertainties and willing to proceed. So one of the key questions is who's best suited to lead prescribing of the cannabinoid, and that comes down to a really important consideration of how confident are you as a practitioner in managing this patient with this particular disease. Some patients are incredibly complex. They've got rare diseases, they've got refractory disease. And normally I think most people would say, well, that's in the realm of a specialist or even a subspecialist for some patients. You need to be very sure that you're very familiar with all the prescribed and other therapies for that particular patient. So we know with the kids with epilepsy, for example, if their liver function tests are going off, do you cut back on their sodium valproate or do you cut back on their cannabidiol? That's something the pediatric neurologists understand. But because they've, worked a lot and become authorised prescribers for cannabidiol in these kids with epilepsy. So they're aware of all the preclinical work, they're aware of the current clinical work. So it's that question, if something's starting to go off once I start prescribing a cannabis medicine, how comfortable am I that it's either a different drug or the cannabis medicine that I'm prescribing? How familiar are you with other options for therapy? So, I would suggest that most general practitioners are fairly comfortable working around palliative care, to some degree with chronic pain. But even so, it's around, for a chronic pain patient, sort of signing them up to a psychoactive long-term drug is not a small decision. Similarly to, prescribing opiates long-term, now that we've got the evidence that it's not a particularly helpful thing to do, is a big decision. And so working through all the other ways of looking after that person first before you'd explore a cannabis medicine. Thinking about how much evidence can you hang your hat on that this is a good thing to do. Probably Wikipedia is not the best place to go hunting for evidence. The ability to manage side effects of the medicines. So, as I said, the drug. And again, even though dependence isn't a particularly high problem with cannabis medicines, if there's already evidence of dependence and considering polypharmacy. So thinking about how confident are you in managing those issues and having those conversations with, at the end of 12 weeks, you're not convinced as the objective practitioner it's making that much difference. Are you really happy to, have that conversation that it's time to stop? So I did mention earlier that there are commercial operations that are here to help. But we are really quite concerned about how some of them are promoting themselves in New South Wales. I'd point out that across Australia, less than 500 approvals have happened. So no one's got a huge body of practice at this point. And the products, as I say, are expanding greatly. So I don't think anyone's across every single product that's currently available on the market. Also, how confident you are in referring someone to a different general practitioner, for example, because a lot of these services are staffed by general practitioners to manage significant health conditions, as compared to you as a general practitioner who is aware of this patient, who's been working with this patient, seeking advice and support, which we'll supply from New South Wales. We've funded a cannabis medicines advisory service. We'll talk a bit more about it later. So if the problem is that you actually don't think this is a good idea, we'd really promote you actually saying to your patient this is not a good idea, and saying why, and being open about your concerns, because sometimes what we're being told is, oh, it's too hard, there's too much paperwork, but underlying all of that is actually, I don't want to do it because I don't think it's a good idea. And if you say, oh, it's too hard, you won't be surprised when you get a call from one of these prescribing services saying, oh, your patients come to us, will you help us support their application? You're kind of jammed then if that's what's happened. But also, we've got a publicly funded service that's there to help you, and we'll do pretty much what the commercial operations are offering to do if you're willing to put that time into that patient, and we're there to help. And also, it's really important that everyone's on the same page when we're prescribing, because if you've got one doctor who's trying really hard to reduce the polypharmacy in a patient, and you've got another doctor saying, here's a new drug, it's not good for the patient, it's not good for anyone. So I'll just put up the slide that we used last time just to talk about some of the things that, the physicians in Canada have suggested that they're comfortable about. In Australia, generally, for neuropathic pain, they'd like to know that somebody has actually seen a pain clinic and has engaged with a pain medicine program. For palliative pain, though, people recognise the expertise of general practitioners in managing palliative care patients. For chemo-induced nausea and vomiting, again, I suggest some caution to make sure that the patient's treating oncologist is also on board with it. If they're on board, that's no problem. But considering there's lots of different reasons why a chemotherapy patient might be vomiting, it might not just be because they've had a low emetogenic chemotherapy and they're saying, well, I'm vomiting because of the chemotherapy. It might be something else going on. So it's really important that everyone's on the page with that. And again, spasticity and multiple sclerosis, where a neurologist has been looking after the person, you've sort of got to that point, you and the neurologist are happy to work together, that's a recognised indication, no problems. So thinking about contraindications, so I've taken this from the product information of Sativex. So thinking about hypersensitivity, so somebody said, I had a really bad trip once and I thought I should, go and jump off a balcony. You might suggest to them that this is not the best thing for them to do. Also, the excipients, so understanding how what carrier oil, those allergies I was talking about. Now, the known or suspected history or family history of schizophrenia or other psychotic illness. There's a really complex relationship between cannabis and schizophrenia. We're even investigating cannabidiol as an antipsychotic. So the real thing is, though, given the narrow evidence base, if you have a patient who has had past psychosis, you would be a very brave person to be prescribing a THC product at the moment. Again, it's around the ability to work with a person with severe personality disorder around cannabis prescribing and managing drug dependence and polypharmacy. Cannabinoids are incredibly lipophilic, and so if the person's breastfeeding, you probably don't want to be prescribing cannabinoids. Similarly, pregnancy, not a particularly good idea. Precautions, so things that you want to think about are older people who, if they get a mild or moderate dizziness, may wind up falling over. So you can make somebody dizzy because, it's not uncommon. There's differences of opinion around THC and what the appropriate age is. There's rat models of rats being exposed to THC as adolescent rats and having brain development issues. There's cohort studies where there's concerns, and again, it's a chicken and egg thing. Are you using cannabis because you are more likely to have a problem, or do you have a problem because you are using cannabis? The Canadians suggest that it's inappropriate to use a THC-containing product for those under 25. The Israelis are using some THC-containing products for kids as young as 5, but generally speaking, you probably don't want to be using a THC product in that age group. Cannabis can give some people a bit of a stress test, particularly THC, and so if somebody's got serious cardiovascular disease, probably not the best thing. There have been, reports of acute stroke and acute AMI after using cannabis, but again, we haven't got consistent concerns. It's there, it's a possibility, so certainly not for unstable angina patients. For epilepsy and seizures, as I said, for some people, THC is proconvulsant, so they'll actually fit more with THC-containing products. And again, generally with older people, because, any delirium is bad news if you're an older person, and so giving somebody something that can cause a delirium is a concern. So then different people will find THC either being, they'll either feel good with it or they'll feel terrible with this, two people, same effect. One person's happiness is another person's misery. The pregnancy, we don't have a lot of safety data in pregnancy. And again, the work and driving issues. And even cannabidiol, which is not going to be on the test, if you've got somebody who previously been stable on all their medications, you put them on cannabidiol, it inhibits their metabolism of their benzodiazepine. They can suddenly be drowsy when they didn't used to be. So it's important to remember that because they're fairly new drugs, sedation from normally, drugs that people are normally tolerating quite well can occur, including some tricyclic antidepressants, for example. So monitoring adverse effects, something that the TGA will ask you about. It's about some effects are common, especially the dizziness. It's important that people understand the oral absorption, the fact that it can take more than an hour to actually get an effect, because there are horror stories from doctors who've initiated somebody and said, we'll just titrate it up gradually, and the person took it, didn't get any effect for half an hour, took another one. I was starting to feel a little bit funny, but didn't really feel it was really worth it. Took another one and wound up completely stoned and very unhappy at the end of that hour. So just to make sure patients are educated that it can take time for oral absorption to work. Again, drug levels of drugs that interact with the cytochrome P450 syndrome system, and recognising that you had one patient that tolerated a dose could be a completely different situation for the next patient. So there's a lot of person-to-person variability. We've talked about negotiating those clear outcomes, and there are some standard assessment tools. The Palliative Care Outcome Collaborative have got a really nice symptom assessment scale for your palliative care patients, and that will also help you pick up on things that, your target symptom might have been anorexia and anxiety, but it'll also pick up on anything else that's improving as part of the treatment that you're giving. And there's a whole wealth of information around pain diaries and monitoring chronic pain patients on the Agency for Clinical Innovation's Chronic Pain Network site.
One of the questions, Jan, is how old is old?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it comes sometimes back to physiological age, doesn't it? So if you've got a very frail 49-year-old, then they're a frail 49-year-old with lots of health conditions. If you've got an incredibly sturdy 70-year-old, you've got an incredibly sturdy 70-year-old. So it's not a hard and fast rule as such. It's really, though, recognising that, the old are particularly vulnerable because we don't have the information, it's very much it's a therapeutic decision. How old is old? It's not like I can say never prescribe to an over 85-year-old. I just wanted to talk through some myths and legends at the moment about cannabis prescribing, because I think these are the things that we see in the media, we see picked up from people's letters to us about what their concerns are. So I just wanted to try and put some of the myths and legends to bed. The first myth is that there's actually a list of conditions that will be approved. There's no set list of conditions. It's all about each case-by-case application to the TGA. It's about knowing that standard evidence-based therapies have been tried and that the person who's making the application has thought about the likely efficacy of the product. We've seen applications approved where the doctors said, look, I've got very little evidence it's likely to work. However, I've thrown everything else as a theoretical benefit. I'd like to try it for my very sick patient. I've seen those approved. And I've seen other applications where somebody's very passionate about it and the TGA has been very concerned about what was being initiated when other therapies that were standard and routine had not been tried. So there's no standard list. One of the other things patients get confused about are cannabis medicines and that they're all synthetic. So as I've discussed, there are a couple of synthetic medicines, but most medicines, both the registered medicine, nabiximols, is plant-derived. It's got traces of other cannabinoids, terpenes, and it is standard. Every time that patient gets that, they get exactly the same mixture. The goods inputted under TGO 93 are plant-derived, and synthetic THC products, they're not commonly used in Australia. They are available, but they're not. TGA does not say no to plant. Pharmaceutical cannabis is more expensive than the black market, and I'm quite honest in saying that it is cheaper to grow things in your own backyard, just like it's cheap to go and harvest the bark off your own willow tree to get your aspirin. Wouldn't recommend that. So for palliative care indications, the cost could be as low as $3 to $10 a day. And I know that's a significant amount of money for some patients, but considering that if they go down to the pub and try and buy a gram of cannabis a day or 2 grams of cannabis a day, they'll be out of pocket a lot more than having a pharmaceutical grade product that you as a doctor have confidence in prescribing to them. My patient will die before they get approved. At the moment, for palliative care patients with complete applications by their usual treating practitioner, we've got an average processing time of about 6 hours. So you put an application in at 6 o'clock one day, it'll be approved by 4 o'clock the next day for sure. You can't get high on medicinal cannabis, and that's something that we see a lot promoted through the media. You can get high on medicinal cannabis. Sometimes we want you to get high on medicinal cannabis as a therapeutic effect. It does depend on the dose of THC. Cannabidiol can decrease the degree of euphoria or dysphoria. However, in a 1-to-1 ratio of cannabidiol and THC, 3 to 10% of patients on nabiximols still feel high. So it doesn't completely get rid of the sensation of intoxication. And we can, if we give you enough nabiximols, make many, many people have a acute paranoid psychotic reaction. Which leads us on to you can't die from a cannabis overdose. So this is a bit like saying people who die in a drunk driving car accident haven't died from their alcohol consumption. You can actually have such an altered behaviour that you do die from trauma. For example, somebody has a hallucination, they're being chased by something and get jumped from a balcony. And we do know that overseas that kids are getting admitted when they've consumed products that were either prescribed by a doctor that had an undisclosed THC content, or where they've accessed some of their parents' stash of edible gummies and so on. And so those kids have wound up seizing, they've wound up in ICU, they've wound up ventilated, which to me is not too many steps from dying from a cannabis overdose. We also have had people who, for example, have been so delirious from self-administered cannabis medicines, they required admission because, for example, they needed their diabetes insulin and because they were so delirious, that was not safe to be administered, and so they've wound up admitted. So again, they might not have died from the cannabis, but problems with DKA, for example. So it's really about trying to say, yes, they're fairly safe in large doses, but they are not completely safe. And as I say, remembering that morbidity is not just from direct overdose, it's also from what happens. So we've drawn a pretty complex maze, I think, at the moment. So let's see if we can help get to the other end of the maze. So last December, the government announced that we were funding a cannabis medicines advisory service. It started operation in February. It has a clinical pharmacologist, so an expert in medicines and drug-drug interactions, and has senior drug information pharmacists working there. It's a New South Wales health service. It's free of charge. It's available to 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and it's there to help. And they can help you with the latest evidence. They can talk you through the regulatory environments. They can help you with tools to monitor progress. They can help you with dosing, titration. I've started my patient on this. This is happening. I'm not sure what to do. All of that, they're there to help. And they're also very aware of which clinical trials are recruiting. So if your patient's eligible for a clinical trial, they can help you refer your patient to a relevant clinical trial. They'll even fill in your paperwork for you. So this is the email address, the telephone 49236200. They are there 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and they are there to help. They'll usually help you the same day, and if not, it'll be the next day service, because depending on the volume of inquiries and depending on how unique your particular inquiry is, but they go away and you've got a unique patient with a unique issue. They'll go away and have a look in the literature for you to see, what evidence is there to use a particular cannabinoid combination for this particular type of patient. And they've also got the network of the whole Hunter New England Local Health District Specialist Network if they just need to ask a colleague, who's a neurologist or something, for some advice as well. So they're there to help. You've got a specialist drug person there to help you. We've also got the TGA guidance that we talked about last week. It has the systematic reviews of the evidence. It doesn't actually give you so much about use 2.5 milligrams twice a day for whatever, but it does give you some idea of where the wind's blowing as far as what to do and perhaps what not to do. And also, I'm just mentioning the Australian Centre for Cannabinoid Clinical and Research Excellence, because we've provided quite a bit of funding to them. They're actually developing clinical guidelines, flowcharts like the Canadian ones for the Australian circumstance, and they're also there to help with, we've had a clinical trial come out. How do we put that information into clinical practice? We've also funded them to be able to perform drug levels of cannabinoids and their metabolites. So if you ring the Cannabis Medicines Advisory Service, who work hand in hand with ACA, they're happy to work together with helping you if you need that particular thing. So a particular thing might be, I've got a patient, I've only given them a small dose, they're off their head, I want to know what's going on with them. Then they're there and they can help. Particularly if, things have been going quite well for a little while. It's not an instant service, it's more of a, what's happened, can I get some idea of what's happening? But again, the clinical pharmacologist from CMAS is there to help understand it. And I think that's me done.
Well done. One of the questions is, if you've got a patient using black market cannabis, have we had any applications to use medicinal cannabinoids to presumably treat them and help them get off their high use of black market cannabis?
So Medicinal is being trialled in Sydney for cannabis withdrawal and reducing cannabis. If it's a straight substitution as a harm minimisation, we haven't got the evidence yet that that's a reasonable thing to do. So if it's just a straight substitution, because we haven't got, like a methadone program for cannabis where you go from black market cannabis to lawful cannabis. However, if a patient has been using a product, and if it's been grown in Australia, it's likely to be a high THC, low CBD product, as we discussed at the last seminar, and they have had some benefit, and say they were managing a particular symptom, and you and perhaps their specialist in that symptom had an agreement that this was a useful thing. Moving them on to a legal cannabis product is not such a bad idea, and probably you need a THC-only product to start with because they're using a high THC product in the community. Or you could move them onto a registered medicine like nabiximols and see if you've got the same effect. So we've certainly had people approved who have used unlawful cannabis products to self-medicate, who were seeing success, whose doctors supported their move to a lawful product for the same symptoms because they could see that it had benefited that person. So it's actually evidence to support that that's happened. But at the same time, it's really about thinking about is that the best move for that patient, or are you just continuing a dependence condition when you should be actually discussing about how to stop?
The other question that's come up is probably a more typical patient that GPs would see, which is the chronic non-cancer pain patient who's tried almost everything or has been on usually the opioids. Where would you put that sort of patient?
And I think this is a really hard one. If we're talking about a patient with neuropathic pain, there's some evidence of benefit. There's also a significant, the NNT to NNH ratio is not fantastic, but then possibly a lot of other manoeuvres that have happened for that patient weren't fantastic either. So and assuming that that person's been probably reviewed by a pain clinic or had been participating in, all the other things, then it's there as if you like a last line to help. For the other non-neuropathic pain patients, the Faculty of Pain Medicine really recommends that this is probably not a place you want to go at the moment. They're suggesting that it's the potential harms are outweighing the benefits. So I'm relying on the assessment of the professional colleagues to suggest that. Looking at the evidence, Faculty of Pain Medicine people say probably not for non-neuropathic pain. But again, there's always exceptions to every rule that have to be a fairly rare and special case.
So even substituting out opiates for cannabinoids?
We're not there yet. Look, it's a really interesting area, and people are really interested about the opiate-sparing effects of cannabinoids, and I think that's a really interesting thing. What we haven't got is really excellent RCT evidence regarding a standard chronic pain, non-neuropathic pain patient and whether we are actually able to consistently reduce their dose of opiates. We've got conflicting evidence, I think, from population studies where in some populations use of a cannabis reduces use of prescribed opiates. And then in other studies, and that's self-report, and then there are other studies where actually the person wasn't using that many opiates anyway when they started on the cannabis medicine when you go back to prescription reports. So what looks like a big decrease in self-report was actually not. They were already on a fairly low dose of opiates when they were personally substituting. We've had that interesting epidemiological phenomenon in America where in some states where they've liberalised cannabis use, the rate of opiate overdose has gone down. But at the same time, usually when they liberalise cannabis use, they start clamping down on opiate prescribing. So, is it because the liberalisation of cannabis came at the same time as a clamp on opiate prescribing? Is it the clamp on opiate prescribing that's decreasing the deaths, or is it the cannabis, or is it both? And we're not there yet. So I don't think the Faculty of Pain Medicine are there.
I think that covers most of the questions that we've gotten for tonight's presentation.
Okay.
As you can see on your screen at the moment, they are the learning outcomes that we went through at the beginning of the session. So we hope that we have covered those for you. I just want to say a big thank you to Jan and Harry for presenting this two-part series. We hope you've all found it very interesting. Thank you all for joining, and thank you again, Harry and Jan.
Thank you.